In the spring of 1979, on a green fold of hill country in southwestern Wisconsin, Greta Halvorsen carried 2 pails of warm milk across the yard and stopped when she saw the first survey stake driven into the ridge above her farm. It stood at the top of the high pasture, a slim wooden lath with a strip of orange flagging tied to it, and the flagging snapped in the wind like something alive. Greta set the pails down on the porch step. The milk steamed in the cool morning. She looked up at that orange ribbon a long time, and the cows behind her went on tearing at the grass, as if nothing in the world had changed. Something had changed. She had heard the rumor at the feed store in March, the way you hear weather, half believing it. The old henning place, 400 acres of ridge and woodlot that bordered her land along the whole eastern line, had been sold, not to a farmer, to a company that meant to build something up there. A resort, a golf course, a place for people from Chicago and Milwaukee to spend money on grass they would never milk a cow on. Now there was a stake in the ground, and the rumor had a face. She was 27, and she ran the dairy alone, the way her father had for the last 6 years of his life. 40 brown Swiss cows, gray-brown and heavy and patient, with bells on the led animals because her grandmother had insisted on bells, and Greta had never had the heart to take them off. A hay barn that leaned a little to the south and dug into the hill behind the house. A stone cellar her grandmother built with a Swiss mason in 1911, cool and damp and dark, where the cheese aged on spruce planks in long golden rows. That cellar was the reason the neighbors thought Greta Halvorsen was a little bit foolish. We will get to that. Let me tell you about the man who came to see her 3 weeks after the stake went in. His name was Mr. Rener. He drove up the lane in a clean tan sedan that had no business on a farm road, parked where the gravel met the grass, and picked his way around the puddles in shoes that had been shined that morning. He found Greta in the cheese house, where she stood over a copper kettle with her sleeves pushed past the elbow, stirring the curd. "Miss Halvorsen?" He had to say it twice over the sound of the stirring. "Carl Rener. I'm with the development group, Crescent Ridge, up on the old henning land. I wonder if I might have a few minutes." Greta did not stop stirring. The curd had just begun to firm into soft white grains under her paddle, and the milk would not wait for a man in good shoes. "You can talk while I work," she said. "It's the cooking. I can't leave it." He set a leather folder on the only clean corner of the table. "I'll be direct, because I respect a person's time. Crescent Ridge is going to be one of the finest resort properties in the upper Midwest. 18 holes, a lodge, a spa. People will fly in for this. And a resort like ours is a feeling. Our guests pay for a view, for quiet, for the sense of arriving somewhere special." He let that settle. "Your operation sits right at the foot of the property, right in the sight line from our best rooms and our signature 4th hole. A working dairy, the smell of it on a warm afternoon. You understand the difficulty. My cows have stood at the foot of that ridge for 60 years, Greta said. The Hennings never minded the smell. The Hennings weren't running a 4-star resort. He said it gently, almost kindly, and that was somehow worse. He drew a single sheet from the folder and turned it to face her. There was a number on it, and it was a large number. "We'd like to acquire your parcel, all of it. This figure is more than this land would ever bring on the open market. You could buy a bigger place anywhere. Flat land, new barns, money in the bank, and never look back." Greta glanced at the paper without picking it up. Her hands kept moving. Outside, she could hear the bell of the lead cow, a low, irregular clanking, and under it the wind in the orange flagging on the ridge. "The dairy isn't for sale, Mr. Rener," she said. He waited, the way men like him wait, certain the silence will do their work for them. The whey settled. The bell clanked. Greta dipped a clean finger into the kettle, tasted, and reached for the salt. "I don't think you understand the scale of what's coming." His voice had cooled 1/4 of a degree. 2 years of construction, blasting on the ridge for the cart paths. After that, traffic, noise, light at night from the lodge. The valley you grew up in is going to be a very different place, and your little operation may not survive it. I'm trying to do you a kindness while there's still a kindness to do." "I appreciate that," Greta said, and she meant it, in a way he would never have credited. "But I'll manage." He closed the folder, and his eyes moved once around the cheese house, over the kettle and the wooden hoops and the door at the back that led down into the dark of the cellar. He took it in the way you take in a thing you have already decided is finished. He thanked her, picked his way back to his clean tan car, and drove off, and the dust of the lane hung in the air and then settled. He believed he had seen the whole of it: a stubborn girl, a few cows, a barn that leaned. He could not have told you what was in the kettle, or what 60 years of grass had taught the milk to become, in the cool dark behind the house. He was building a mountain, and he had no idea she already owned what people would actually drive there for. The whole valley agreed with Mr. Rener. That was the hard part. The word went around fast, the way it does where everyone milks at the same hours and meets at the same diner after. Greta Halvorsen had turned down a fortune without opening the folder all the way. Stubborn as her father, that whole family never did know when to quit. She could have walked away rich. Now she'll milk cows in the shadow of that thing the rest of her life. And there was the older joke, told for years before Mr. Rener ever drove up. Every other dairy in the valley shipped its milk. You hooked the bulk tank to the co-op truck, and twice a month a check arrived. Greta shipped some of hers too. But the best of it, the morning milk from the high pasture in the green months, she did not ship. She turned it into wheels and aged them in her grandmother's cellar the better part of a year before a single one was sold. Money you put in and did not see again for 12 months. On cheese, most of her neighbors thought a strange old country indulgence nobody under 70 wanted to eat. Wasting good milk, they said. Playing at the old ways, while the rest of us make a living. Her grandmother, Attili, had come over from a valley in the Swiss canton of Bern in 1909 with a wooden trunk, a set of cheese hoops, and the knowledge in her hands. She had chosen this hillside for a reason: the spring that came up cold and mineral out of the limestone, the south slope that held the sun, the clover that grew thick where the spring water ran. She used to set a hand flat against the stone wall of the cellar and say a thing Greta had heard so often it had worn smooth as a creek stone. "Good cheese," Attili would say, "is only patience you can eat." And Greta's father, Anton, who taught her the cows the way you teach a language, by living inside it, had his own line. He'd say it in the high pasture with a stem of grass in his teeth. "Milk can't lie, Greta. It tastes like wherever it stood. You get it right out here, in the grass, or you don't get it at all." Both were gone now. Her grandmother when Greta was 16, her father 6 years back. The winter his heart gave out between the morning and the evening milking. What they left her was not money. It was 40 brown Swiss, a cellar full of aging gold, a cloth-bound book of recipes written half in German, and a way of standing in the grass and listening to it that the men at the diner would have laughed at. So she did not explain it. She let them laugh, and she went on making cheese while they built the resort. The construction began that summer, and the valley Greta had been born into came apart at the seams. The blasting came first. 3 or 4 times a day the ground jumped under her boots, and a flat, hard crack rolled down the slope, and the cows threw their heads up and bunched at the far fence. Then the trucks, all day, raising a pale dust that drifted down and settled on the grass along the eastern line until it went gray. The spring at the top of the slope ran muddy for a week after they graded near its head, and Greta stood over it, with her stomach gone to water until it cleared. Her cows felt all of it. A brown Swiss is a calm animal, but a cow that is unsettled gives less milk and gives it grudgingly, and by August, her tank was down. She moved the herd to the lower pasture, away from the noise, where the grass grew thinner, and the milk that came from there was thinner too. Good milk, but not the milk her grandmother had chosen this hill to make. She kept making cheese anyway, because stopping was a kind of dying and she knew it. And the bank, which carried a small note on the milking equipment her father bought the year before he died, sent a man around in the fall to talk about her numbers. He turned his hat in his hands at her kitchen table and told her, not unkindly, that her shipping income was down, that a sensible person might think hard about the offer everyone knew she'd had. He left a card. She put it in the drawer with the spoons. Then came the worst night, and everything after turns on it. It was the second winter of the construction, February. A storm that shut the roads for 2 days. One of her older cows went down in the night, trying to calve, and Greta spent the dark hours on her knees in the straw, working by the light of a hung lantern, and in the end she saved the cow but lost the calf. She came back to the house near dawn with the dead calf in her arms and her sleeves frozen stiff, so tired she could not feel her own hands. The fire had burned to nothing. The house was cold to the bone. Up on the ridge, through the blowing snow, the lights of the half-built lodge burned steady and warm and indifferent. She sat at the kitchen table without taking off her coat. The bank's card was in the drawer a foot from her hand. The number on Mr. Rener's paper went through her head, and behind it the flat land, the new barns, the money sitting quiet where no storm could touch it. She could be warm. She could sleep. She could stop fighting a thing the whole valley had already told her she was going to lose. She put her hand on the drawer. On the wall above the table hung her grandmother's cheese book, and tucked into the front of it, a creased photograph of Adelie, in front of the cellar door, with a wheel of cheese held against her hip like a child. An old woman in an apron, squinting into the sun, with hands like roots. Good cheese is only patience you can eat. Greta took her hand off the drawer. She built the fire back, feeding it slow until it caught. She put the coffee on, and she sat in her frozen coat and watched the flames climb until the gray light came up over the snow. And somewhere in there, without any words for it, she decided she was not leaving. Not for the noise, not for the money, not for the lights on the ridge. Her grandmother had set her hand on that cellar wall. Her father had stood in that grass. She did not waver again. The resort opened in 1981, and it was everything Mr. Rener had promised. It was beautiful in its way. The lodge sat on the crown of the ridge, with long windows over the whole green valley. A pool that glittered turquoise. Fairways rolled flat and bright, as billiard felt. Little flags that stood dead still in the morning and leaned in the afternoon wind. And from every good room, from the terrace, from the famous fourth tee, you looked down and saw the Halvorsen dairy, the White House, the leaning barn, the 40 brown Swiss moving across the green like slow brown stones. Exactly the thing Mr. Rener had wanted gone, laid out below his best views like a picture nobody had asked for. At first the guests only looked. A working farm was charming scenery to people who had never smelled one up close, and on a warm afternoon they smelled it, made faces, and went back to the pool. The resort had a grand dining room, all white linen and candlelight, and at the head of its kitchen the company had installed a chef they'd lured from a city restaurant, a Frenchman named Maurice Belil, who had cooked for people whose names were in magazines. Sauces that took 2 days. Towers of food under silver domes, lifted away with a flourish. He heard about the cheese lady at the bottom of the hill within his first month, and when Greta appeared at his service door one afternoon with a wedge of her aged wheel wrapped in cloth, hoping a neighbor might buy from a neighbor, he came out and looked at it the way Mr. Rener had looked at her cheese house. He cut a sliver. He tasted it. Nothing moved on his face. "It is rustic," Belial said. He set the rest down on the steel counter and wiped his fingers. "Farmhouse. For what it is not bad." He said it the way you pat a child on the head. "But my guests have eaten in Paris, in Lyon. I cannot serve a cheese made in a cellar behind a barn, and tell them it belongs beside what I do here. It would be a confusion of categories. Perhaps the staff canteen, I could ask. Greta wrapped her cheese back in its cloth. No, she said. Thank you. And she carried it home up the lane in the heat with her chin level, and put it back on the spruce plank in the dark with its brothers, and said nothing to anyone. She had stood in a cold kitchen one February, with her hand on a drawer. After a night like that, a Frenchman's opinion of her cheese could not touch the thing underneath, so she went back to her cows. And the milk, you have to understand, had come back. With the blasting finished and the road quiet, with the herd returned to the high pasture and the spring running cold and clean again, the morning milk in the green months was once more the milk her grandmother had chosen this hill to make. Rich and sweet and faintly grassy, the cream rising thick and gold. The wheels she pressed that summer went down into the cellar and began, in the cool and the dark, to become what only that milk and that patience could make them. And up on the ridge, the first guest wandered down the hill. Nobody planned it. A man walking the back nine on a slow afternoon followed a farm lane out of idle curiosity, came to a stone door in the side of a hill standing open to let the air move, and looked down into a cellar full of gold. Greta was inside, turning the wheels, brushing each one and setting it back, 100 wheels and more on the long plank shelves. The man stood in the doorway with the daylight behind him and asked, half laughing, what on earth this was. She cut him a piece. She always would, for anyone who asked honestly. She told him where the milk came from, the name of the cow whose grass he was tasting, the spring, the hill. He ate it in the cool of the doorway, with the smell of stone and earth and aging cheese all around him. And something happened on his face that had not happened on the chef's. He bought a whole wheel and carried it up the hill under his arm like a trophy. That night at dinner, when his table asked where he'd gotten it, he told them. The next afternoon there were 3 people at the cellar door. The afternoon after that, 6. The thing the resort had built to look down on had become the thing its guests came down to find. It went the way a slow flood goes. By midsummer, the lane was busy every afternoon. People in golf clothes and white tennis shoes picking their way down the hill Mr. Rener had graded so handsomely, coming to sit in a cheese cellar behind a barn. Greta set out a few stools, then a plank table in the yard under the maple. She cut samples and poured cold buttermilk in glass jars and told the story of the place, the way her grandmother had told it, and the guests who had paid a great deal of money to get away from their lives sat in a farmyard and felt, for an hour, like they'd come home to one. They did not just buy cheese. They abandoned the resort to come and get it. The pro shop watched afternoon tea times go unclaimed. The pool emptied after lunch, and the grand dining room sat with empty tables while its guests were down the hill, eating a farmhouse cheese off a plank under a maple, asking Greta Halvorsen how long it aged. Rener's people could not understand it. They had built a temple to getting away from it all, and their congregation kept slipping out the side door to go stand in the it-all they had paid to escape. The vindication, when it came from far outside the valley. There was a national cheese competition that fall, the kind judged by people who tasted 300 cheeses in a weekend and spat most of them out. A food writer who'd come up to the resort had gone down the hill like everyone else, gone home with a wheel and a story, and pressed Greta until she agreed to send one in. She almost didn't. The entry fee was money she couldn't afford to lose. She sent a wheel of the previous winter's aging, the high pasture milk, 18 months down in the dark. It took the top award in its class. Best in show across every farmstead cheese in the country. The news ran in a magazine with a photograph of an old stone cellar door and a line about a young woman in Wisconsin making the finest aged cheese in America in a cave her Swiss grandmother had dug by hand. The phone in Greta's kitchen, which had rung maybe twice a week her whole life, began to ring every morning and not stop. Shops from Chicago, a grocer from New York, people who wanted to drive 4 hours to stand in the cellar she'd nearly walked away from on a February night, And the resort, which had tried to make her cheese disappear, found itself in a position the staff laughed about for years. Their own guests now booked rooms specifically to visit the dairy at the bottom of the hill. The exodus down the lane grew so large that the lodge had no choice but to manage it. They put a young man from the front desk in charge of what they called, on the daily schedule, the dairy excursion, and twice an afternoon, he led a string of guests down the graded hill to the cellar door and back. His whole job was to ferry paying guests away from the resort's own restaurant and pool, down to a farmyard, to eat a cheese the resort's own chef had called a confusion of categories. The company had spent millions to give people a reason to come to that ridge. The reason was at the bottom of it, in the dark, on a spruce plank, and had been there for 70 years. Maurice Belisle put the cheese on his menu by the end of the second summer. He had no choice. His guests asked for it by name and would not be talked into anything else. He priced a single wedge higher than Greta sold a whole wheel for at her own door. He never came down the hill himself, but the resort began ordering from her in quantity, paying on time, asking, almost shyly through the kitchen, whether she had any extra of the 18-month. She always did. She never raised the cellar door price by a penny, because her grandmother had not built that cellar to gouge a neighbor. It was 4 years after the resort opened that Mr. Rener came back down the lane. He came alone, in an ordinary car this time, and parked where the gravel met the grass, and did not bother about his shoes. He was older, the trimness gone a little soft. He found Greta in the yard under the maple, wrapping a wheel for a customer, and waited off to the side, hands in his pockets, until she was done. For a while he just looked around, at the cars in the lane, at the plank tables, all of them full, at the new sign by the cellar door with her grandmother's name on it, because Greta had named the cheese Otillie, at the line of guests his own resort had sent down, eating in a farmyard in the late sun. "We ran the numbers on this property for 8 months before we broke ground," he said at last. "The best people. Projections, sight lines, traffic studies." He shook his head slowly. "We never once put your farm in the plus column. It was a liability on every page." He looked at her, and there was no smile this time, just a tired man squinting at a thing he had gotten wrong. How did you do this? We had everything. The money, the land, the experts, and the thing everybody actually drives up here for is the one thing we tried to buy out of the way." Greta set down her cloth. She looked up the hill at the lodge glittering on its crown, then out at the high pasture where the herd stood in the long light, then back at the man. "You built people a place to get away from their lives, Mr. Rener," she said. "That's a fine thing to sell. But it turns out a lot of them weren't trying to get away from anything. They just wanted something that tasted like the life they were homesick for. You sold them a view of the valley. I let them taste it." He stood with that a long moment. Then he gave a short breath that was almost a laugh, almost not. "My partners called you a stubborn girl," he said. "I think I did too." "I know," Greta said. "We were wrong." He held out his hand. "I was wrong." She shook it. It was not a victory, and she did not treat it like one. It was a thing more like the end of a long weather. He bought a wheel before he left, paid cash like anyone else, and went back up the hill. And Greta turned to the next person in line. "Let me tell you what that valley looks like now." The years that followed were the quiet, fruitful kind. Greta never grew the dairy past what one good herd and one good cellar could honestly make. Men in suits, different men, came every few years wanting to franchise the name and put Otillie in every grocery in the country. She told them what her grandmother would have told them. The moment you make it bigger than the hill, it stops tasting like the hill, and then you are selling a label, not a cheese. She kept the herd at 40. The waiting list ran past a year, and she did not mind. The people who understood that good cheese is only patience you can eat were happy to wait. She bought back land instead. When a neighbor finally gave up shipping milk for a check that no longer covered the feed, Greta bought his acres at a fair price and turned the cows out. and the grass came back, slow, the way the high pasture had after the blasting stopped. Over 20 years, she did it 3 more times, until her hill was an island of deep green pasture in a valley that had mostly given up on cows. The resort is still up on the ridge. It has changed hands twice. The golf course is fine, people say. But ask anyone who's been there what they remember, and they don't talk about the 4th hole. They talk about the cellar at the bottom of the hill, the old stone door, the cheese, and the woman who told them the name of the cow whose grass they were tasting. The lodge gave up fighting it long ago. Their most expensive package now includes a guaranteed afternoon at the Halvorsen dairy, and the brochures that once would have cropped her farm out of every photograph put the cellar door on the cover. They could not beat her, so they learned to stand next to her and call it a partnership and hope nobody remembered who had been there first. Greta Halvorsen is in her 70s now. Her hands are her grandmother's hands, roots and knuckles, strong enough still to turn a wheel. She doesn't milk before dawn anymore, but she's in the cellar most days, brushing the rinds, setting each wheel back on its plank. And on a fine afternoon you might find her in the high pasture, with a girl of 9 or 10 beside her, her grandniece, the 2 of them standing in the clover, while the brown Swiss move around them, and the bells go on the lead cows. She'll hand the girl a stem of grass, and have her chew it, taste the green of it, then have her taste the morning milk, warm from the same pasture, so the child learns with her own mouth what her great-great-grandmother carried over the ocean in her hands. The cloth-bound book is hers now, the recipes half in German, the creased photograph in the front. One day the cellar will be hers, and the hill and the herd, and the long, slow patience of the place. They thought the story was about the resort they were building on the mountain. They were wrong. It was always about the dairy at the bottom of the hill, the grass, the cold spring, and a girl who would not leave. They said the valley was worth more, with a resort on it. She kept the herd, and the spring ran cold, and the grass grew back, and the milk remembered every bit of it, and so did everyone who ever tasted what she made of it.